Hi, welcome back to Reading Pathways. I'm Matt, and just checking in with kind of an update. This is maybe more one of those videos where there's just a bunch of random synapses firing, a bunch of random connections that I'm sensing in some of my reading right now, and some weird little coincidences I keep coming across. Initially, when I started this channel, that's kind of the thing I was obsessed about with starting out on a reading journey. Not so much focused on it these days as I was then, but it certainly still happens, and it's fascinating to me, these kind of connections that happen sometimes with what I'm reading and how they kind of interact with each other. So I just kind of wanted to highlight a couple of those today. So it might be a little incoherent and rambling. I'll try to make sense of it, but I have some notes I'm going to try to look at just to keep this in some kind of sequential order. So let's start with I'm reading The Cave in the Light by Arthur Herman, which is kind of a study of Plato and Aristotle's philosophy sort of 2,500 years ago, and then kind of how their ways of thinking and their philosophical doctrines kind of, continued on through, history from that point forward and influenced future generations, future figures. And it's kind of interesting how it's going. It's going like, each chapter takes like a leap ahead chronologically in time. Sometimes it's 100 years, could be 50 years, or it could be 250 years, whatever it takes, for Herman to get to kind of the next notable figure or time period. And I'm really enjoying it. It's definitely been fascinating. And I think I'm nearing the halfway point. I'm on chapter 14, where we're going to go into Thomas Aquinas, it looks like, next. So we're in the Middle Ages, but I just, the thought that really captured me last night when I was reading this, more so than anything else, was how incredibly short the span of human history is. I mean, it's a thought that I'm sure everybody has had at some point in differing variations, but yeah, it's just like a drop in the bucket in terms of the history of the earth and the history of thinking humans, writing humans whose thoughts have been preserved in a manner that we can study them like this is so incredibly short. And it made me think of kind of how we're really not that far removed from Plato, Aristotle, and all the other figures that have been discussed in this book, like Julius Caesar, Constantine, Roman emperors, Saint Augustine, and even Alexander the Great. And Herman's done a good job of sort of tracing the path of the intellectual thought of all these figures. But what's really tripping me right now on this is the time frame. It's just incredible to think. Like, I think what struck me last night was thinking how, he jumps a few chapters from Plato and Aristotle, and all of a sudden you're at Julius Caesar, and it's several hundred years later, but it makes you think, like, at that time when Julius Caesar was reigning, Plato and Aristotle were in the very not so distant past for him. He would think of them as, sort of still very relevant and timely, even though they died a few hundred years ago. I almost had this like analogy of like, you know, people around that time period would think of Plato and Aristotle the way we would of like, you know, Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, like some forefathers that we think of as, 250, 300 years ago. But we don't think of them as ancient whatsoever. We think of them as, several generations on top of several more generations removed from us today. And, people in Julius Caesar's time and whatnot thought about these figures in the same way. So it just made me realize, like, you only need a couple of those sequential jumps in time to get from them to us today. And when I had that realization, again, which is nothing new, but it just kind of made this even more enjoyable to think about. So I'm definitely enjoying that. And then in the spirit of kind of, random connections and stuff, so I'm still reading Dinosaur in a Haystack, Stephen Jay Gould's essay collection, in his reflections on natural history. I think there's 7 of these books. This might be the last one, the most recent of his essay collections that were put together. So just a couple like little connections in here I've come across to things. So first of all, connecting to that idea I just talked about of the short span of human history, there's an essay in here I just finished yesterday, Can We Complete Darwin's Revolution? And he's talking about some articles written on modern evolutionary thought and stuff. And he says, the shape of human species, scientists say, is raising tantalizing questions about where humanity will go from here. Is human evolution ending, ushering in a long maturity in which Homo sapiens persists pretty much unchanged? The article then gave an accurate account of the fact that human anatomy has not altered substantially for the past 100,000 years or so. The Cro-Magnon people who painted the great caves of Europe some 20 to 30,000 years ago were indistinguishable from us. So I think I read that little portion right around when I was having the same epiphany of the short span of thinking human history that I came across with The Cave and the Light. So that was interesting. And then on the same page in this essay, Can We Complete Darwin's Revolution? Again, this video is a little more of a callback to some of these coincidences and some of these pathway things that kind of kicked off this channel for me. But I came across this sentence here. So in this essay, Gould is basically responding to articles and some thoughts around the time he was writing this that were sort of questioning whether human evolution is sort of petering out, whether it's kind of run its course. And they're saying it in kind of a negative way or a disappointed way, I guess, like where aren't we going to change more? Aren't we going to evolve more? And Gould is saying, well, no, not necessarily. We may not. Natural selection is sort of just runs its course as it will, and there's really no necessary end point or necessary change that we have to undergo. It's just kind of what the Darwinian natural course demands. And then I came across this paragraph here. So he says there's 3 errors in that way of thinking that he's responding to. And I couldn't help but read this paragraph and align it a little bit, analogize it a little bit with sort of my view of my reading at this point. And maybe it'll make sense when I read it. But to me, it did. So he says, correct the 3 errors and we may grasp evolution as a process causally driven by struggle among individuals for reproductive success and not by any principle working bountifully for the good of species or any other higher entity in nature. We may then view life's history as an unpredictable set of largely fortuitous and eminently interruptible excursions down highly contingent pathways, and we will understand successful species as islands of temporary stability, not as striving entities in a flux of constant improvement. So I almost laughed when I saw the word pathways, because I thought, oh, maybe that's a good way to define my reading, journey right now, is an unpredictable set of largely fortuitous and eminently interruptible excursions down highly contingent pathways. I mean, that rings true a little bit for how I read. I base it on the fortuitousness of what books I find when I'm book hunting, but I also follow these sort of connections and pathways that don't always necessarily feel driven by me, but more driven by sort of what's out there and what flow I find myself in. And we will understand successful, let me just substitute in the word reader here, because maybe that, will make sense at this point. We will understand a successful reader as an island of temporary stability, not as striving entities in a flux of constant improvement. So I think that's a good goal for me as a reader, and can define the evolution of my reading at this point as a still, early point in my reading journey. I'm sort of in that flux stage still right now, evolutionarily speaking, where I'm kind of grasping and changing and picking up these pathways that my reading natural selection is kind of dictating. But then the goal being, and this is kind of that whole establishing a reading baseline series I'm doing, where I'm kind of showing the books that I plan to utilize in this evolution of me as a reader. But the goal being, once I read through that and get to a point where I'm pretty established as a reader, hopefully I'll become an island of temporary stability, as Gould puts it. And that would basically be, somebody who's reached a solid point as a reader, has a good informed sense of their interests, their niches, favorite authors, and can then build off of that. So that's I don't know, that paragraph kind of connected to the whole establishing a reading baseline, reading pathways idea. And then, so now the next part here, there's just another kind of theme that I kind of kept bouncing up against this past weekend, and a couple things I started reading. So just wanted to highlight that. So the theme here, if I had to define it, I guess I can call it sort of like universality, universal language, universal humanity, that kind of thing. So, first of all, let's start with a book that I kind of fortuitously came across. So, I had an event at my daughter's school this past weekend, and it was sort of a movie event, and I've been to a couple of these now, and since I got my Kindle, I have discovered the joys of having a Kindle during these events, if you can focus over the sounds of the children and the loud movie and everything like that, which is a task in its own right. But so I went in with nothing currently on my Kindle I was reading, so I said, okay, well, this is perfect. This is a good time to load up something new. So for Kindle right now, I'm basically doing Project Gutenberg and also Libby, seeing what's at the library I can borrow. I had a book on my TBR by Sandra Newman called Julia, and it's a retelling of 1984 from the character Julia's perspective, and I heard great things about it. I loved 1984 when I read it last year, and I especially loved the character Julia, so I flagged that book. So I punched in Sandra Newman and Libby to see if maybe that book was available. It wasn't, but there was one book available from her, which was The Country of Ice Cream Star. Hadn't heard of it before, but it seemed like one of those moments of, this is where it's leading me right now. This is kind of what the pathway's doing, so I'm going to follow it. So I downloaded The Country of Ice Cream Star. And right off the bat, so you're thrown into this world of post-apocalyptic, dystopian kind of world. I guess she does maybe have a flair for the dystopian. But these teenagers are left in this sort of post-disease-ridden America. And most of the population seem to have succumbed to this disease. Some maybe have fled abroad, but they're like these roving band of children that band together, and they're just kind of like sticking together and trying to, I'm still early in this. I read about 5 chapters, I think. I'm like maybe 30 or 40 pages in. But yeah, so the interesting thing about this is their communication. They speak in this dialect that is clearly English, but with a twist, because they're sort of, I don't know exactly how far in the future they are, but typical English language, modern English has obviously been degraded at this point, where they're now speaking in this dialect, which I read a few reviews of this, and people refer to it as pidgin or pidgin. I don't know how to pronounce it, Pidgin. And so I hadn't heard that term before. And then I saw a few reviews that said basically the way the characters talk in this pidgin language, like this sort of broken down English dialect, it takes a little while to get used to, but it's really rewarding if you do the effort and you put in the effort to sort of learn their lingo and follow it. And so far, I found it pretty doable. The more I try to go through this, I'm sure it'll get better. And of course, that reminded me of a book I read earlier this year, which is kind of infamous for that very effort that you have to engage in, and that's Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, specifically the centerpiece story in this. So, the kind of climactic middle piece of this, the longest short story in this novel, and the only one that's told all the way through in one sitting from front to back, and that's obviously Sluicia's Crossing and everything after. So in Sluicia's Crossing, it's very much the same. It's a post-apocalyptic Earth, hundreds and hundreds of years in the future, and the characters are now devolved into speaking, or evolved, I guess. Maybe Gould would say they've evolved. I don't know which way they're heading, but they're speaking in this broken down English dialect. And one of the reviews of Sandra Newman's book that I came across said, basically it might remind you of Cloud Atlas and how they talk. And I loved Cloud Atlas. I also specifically loved Sluicia's Crossing, the middle portion. It created one of my favorite literary characters that I've ever read to this point in Zachary, who's the main character of that Sluicious Crossing story. But yeah, it was an effort to get a hold of the dialect in Sluicious Crossing, and become comfortable reading it. But once you did, you really do get pulled into the story, maybe even more so than normal, because when you're just reading typical language and typical dialect you're used to, it's probably easier to just kind of get complacent a little bit and sit back and let the language wash over you. Whereas this, something like that requires a little more of a consistent effort, and you have to be more plugged in, or else you're going to completely miss everything. So I just thought it was very coincidental that I don't know how many books there are out there. There can't be that many where the dialect and the lingo of the main characters can be described as pidgin or something like that, broken down English, because they're in a post-apocalyptic scenario. And so it just was kind of a coincidence. I haven't read all that many books, so when I have something like this connect so strongly in a way to something I read earlier this year, it just so happens. I find that that's one of these pathway connections that I just can't ignore. So, and then there was another tack onto that too. So after I started The Country of Ice Cream Star, going back to Gould again, literally in the next essay, right after the one I just talked about, it's a humongous fungus among us. And he's talking about this giant fungus that was discovered in Michigan. And the point of this is sort of, what is an individual? Because there were some claims when this fungus was discovered that it was the largest single organism ever discovered, bigger than blue whales, bigger than redwood trees. And of course, that sparked debate about, well, what is an individual? Where do you draw that line? And Gould took that debate and kind of then in the next essay talked about, because they're kind of related, some of these evolutionary essays, he talked about, well, what is universal then? What makes humanity universal and different from other species, something that everybody's thought about before. And in this essay, he actually basically looks at language and says that pretty much language is the answer to that. And I couldn't believe it, because then he's talking about the development of Creole languages, when sort of people have to communicate with each other and they don't really have a shared language. And then I turn the page, and then he starts talking about pigeons. People using pidgin language to communicate with each other, all in furtherance of his argument that what is the one thing that makes us all human, and what is the one universal language that binds us together? And it's just that, it's actually language itself. And he talks about how studies have shown that people who are required to use pidgin language or Creole language together, even though they have no shared background, no shared vernacular or verbiage or anything, they will conjugate verbs in the same way. Language will develop. They will make plurals the same way. Language will sort of develop in common ways across different people, no matter what circumstance they're in. But yeah, and so I had literally just started The Country of Ice Cream Star, where, as best I can tell, that's basically what's going on here. Is these bands of children are now roaming this post-apocalyptic world, trying to communicate with each other in this pidgin language. And then the next day, in the next Gould essay I read, he's talking about how pidgin language is an example of the universality of language. So that was those connections. And then one last thing on the theme of universal language. I just started this audiobook yesterday. And so this is by Daniel J. Levitin, and it's I Heard There Was a Secret Chord, Music as Medicine. And I only got like a chapter into this. I haven't done an audiobook in a little while, but this was on my TBR for quite some time. And he's a neuroscientist. He's got a bunch of best-selling books on music, not so much music theory, but music and its cognitive impacts, music and its neuroscientific connections. And so I have This Is Your Brain on Music by him, which I think is his most famous best-selling book. And then I also have The World in 6 Songs So those two I haven't read, but looking forward to checking those out. But this is his newest one from 2024. And I kind of wanted to specifically read this on audio because I'm still not quite 100% there with doing audiobooks yet with novels. I have done one this year. I actually listened to the Three Body Problem on audio, but I found I'm struggling a little more with novels doing it. But with something like this, where it's a nonfiction study of music, and particularly music, because there will be some bonus content in doing an audiobook for this specific type of thing. I think there's going to be music clips, there's going to be sound effects and things like that that kind of go towards the argument here. But anyway, I just started this, and right off the bat, within the first couple pages of and it's narrated by the author too, Daniel J. Levitin, which I always appreciate when the author narrates it. Immediately, first couple pages, he's talking about Plato and Aristotle, and what their view on music was, and then he's talking about the universality of music, and how obviously there's a famous quote on that music is the universal language. It seems that Gould, in his essay in Dinosaur in a Haystack, would push back and say language is the universal language, but maybe music plays a close second. But Daniel J. Levitin dropped that quote right at the beginning of this about how music is the universal language, and I had in my brain was firing all this stuff about universality and universal language and pidgin language and Creole language and how we can all communicate with each other. So yeah, it just seemed to fit the bill. I didn't pick it for that reason. I just wanted an audiobook to start and noticed that this became available. I had looked for this for a few months after it was released and didn't see the audio was available, but now I found it. So got this one started. So I think that's basically the wrap up. I hope you can follow those connections. I even can't really anymore at this point, but I just wanted to share some of those kind of interesting little pathway connections and coincidences that always keep me intrigued and keep me interested to see where my reading's going to go based off of them. So yeah, I think that's it. Hope everybody's having a good holiday season, at least here in America. And yeah, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll be back with more updates soon.